Hi, good afternoon. My, that is loud. Hi, I'm Scott Pace, and I'm currently the director of the Space Policy Institute. I see a lot of familiar faces here in the audience today. Here on this panel to share their insights and expertise, Roy Azevedo. Roy is the president of Raytheon Intelligence and Space, and Alex MacDonald. Alex is NASA's chief economist. One could make a number of different observations about being an economist in NASA, but Alex has heard them all, so don't bother. What I'd like to do today is really to start with some brief comments from each of our panelists, and then just launch into a quick Q&A and discussion, which of course is usually the most important part. Roy, would you like to start?
Scott, I'd just like to say that hopefully we're going to have a conversation that we inform folks and they learn about not just space and not just Raytheon, but across the board. And certainly I know Alex will represent well between the military and federal civil side.
Okay. Alex?
Yep, Scott, just a pleasure to be here with everyone. It's an exciting conference I look forward to participating in as well after this. And it's just obviously such an incredibly exciting time with the Artemis program here, getting ready to get started. It is historic moment, and it's a great honor to be able to share it with you.
Okay. So I'm currently at a university, so if I occasionally lapse into being an overly academic, please forgive me. Just sort of the way I work these days. One of the things we talk about in university times is the different roles that government has. The government can be, of course, a patron of R&D, an important starter. They can be an important first customer. They can be an anchor tenant. They're a regulator of activities. They can sometimes be a competitor for industry out there. So if we think about these different roles that government can play, it's particularly complex in the defense and aerospace sectors where government is such a strong part of everything we do. But what we've seen over the last few years is the growth of the commercial industry, or market forces are driving activities much more powerfully than before, and then changing the nature of these government roles that we've had from maybe a more traditional top-down one to really where there's more of a collaborative relationship. So the first thing I wanted to lead off with is, as the U.S. government and its allies respond to events in space, please talk to me about what you see as the role of industry from an industry perspective and a government perspective, and in areas where you think industry can be a particularly helpful driver for security and resilience, risk reduction, and maybe how do these activities play into sort of our soft power, the diplomacy, the Artemis Accords, the shaping of norms of behavior in this environment, and so that we maybe have a more safer and secure world, more prosperous world, through the activities of industry and government partnership. Either one of you want to start?
So, Scott, I guess the way I'd respond to that is the way that I view Raytheon Technologies as an industry member and its role is much like you said. There are multiple activities and roles that we play in. Certainly there are top-down. As far as what role industry in general can play, I think that the United States, the world, would be and will be a better place the more that industry works with our government partners and other industry partners in terms of making the world a safer place, because we're bringing innovation and we're partnering. Raytheon Technologies, we've been in the space business for over 50 years, everything from weather, intelligence, certainly military activities, and one of the areas that we're working on quite a bit is with the Department of Defense. And so I do believe that in terms of industry and its role, the single most important thing is to bring innovation to bear and for us to learn from all of the activities that we work with in government and with our partners.
Alex?
Yeah, Scott, I want to pull on the soft power element of your question. When the U.S. went to the moon the first time, there was a famous memo, famous at least within space nerds, called the Webb-McNamara memo. Of course, James Webb was the head of NASA at the time, and Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense. And in that memo, they laid out that there was actually no military purpose for going to the moon. However, there was an important national security purpose in using the really challenging signal of going to the moon, of taking someone to the moon and returning to the Earth, using that as a signal to the world of the capacity of the United States, of the commitment to the United States to technological frontiers, and it very much served that purpose. It served a strong soft power purpose. And at the same time, President Johnson used that moment and that commitment to push forward the original Outer Space Treaty, which was one of the most important developments, I would argue, for the security that we've all enjoyed in the space environment in the last 50 plus years. Because it established, most importantly at that time, that we weren't going to situate nuclear weapons in Earth orbit, but also that we were committed in general to the peaceful uses of outer space in perpetuity. And today, obviously with the Artemis program, we are returning to the moon for some similar reasons. And at the same time, we also have an analogous effort with the Artemis Accords, because we recognize that right now, in order to maintain our security in a more general sense in Earth orbit, we need to maintain it as a place of rules, of behavior, of norms. And in that regard, I think the support of the US in the UN of a resolution around ASAT tests is incredibly important, because that's a commitment to a peaceful low Earth orbit environment, which we all know is needed for business. So I think the way in which exploration and soft power interact today is actually very similar and analogous to what we were seeing in the 60s.
Yeah, I think that there absolutely are analogies to the Cold War in terms of the importance of and symbolism. But of course, it's different today. The geopolitical environment is different today. So if in the Cold War, Apollo was about, look what we can do by ourselves, and isn't that impressive? Today, it's look what we can do with commercial friends and partners. And so we have a much more globalized environment. We have a much more democratized environment with many more players in the field, both internationally and certainly in industry. And so the question is, how do I get that large grouping to kind of go in a common direction and shape them together? So having those kind of partnerships is an important way of the way we respond to the environment today, and why it's very different than the Cold War, although some of the aspects are the same. Roy, I wanted to ask you about, we talked a little bit sort of NASA and maybe defense issues, but you also work with NOAA and NASA in sort of Earth observation. At the recent Space Council meeting, the Vice President made a point about climate change and how Earth observation, of course, is supported by space observations, and how she wanted to emphasize that more. Can you talk a little bit about what is Raytheon doing, and what do you see your partners doing to do more Earth observation work?
Yeah, so we have several programs, several technologies that have been developed. One of the things that I know I like to show the entire workforce is some of the products, some of the images that we have. We have a instrument that's called VIIRS, and in a world of acronyms, so it's Visible Infrared Imaging Radiometry Suite. Fancy camera. But that fancy camera from outer space is what provides a lot of pictures that you see in the weather with these hurricanes forming. And so we talk about national security. Most people tend to think of defense, but certainly we like to think of the fact that what we contribute from the Earth observation programs in terms of, imagine a hurricane coming down on a populated coast. Well, having those weather patterns, understanding the weather patterns, making that data available to many, many parties so that we can continue to learn. And then from there, we've got everything with small sats that are out there measuring methane in the environment. And so I think one of the things that we contribute, and especially working with organizations like NOAA and NASA, is we do have the instruments, but that data is available to many, many folks, including academia, so that we can continue to learn from what we observe. And certainly we consider, in terms of contributing to that weather pattern, weather prevention, fire detection, early fire detection, is something that is certainly contributing to national security.
Yeah, the VIIRS instrument is actually a really critical one for wildfire ignition detection. And one of the things that we're realizing as our analysis of climate change becomes more and more robust every year is that we're in for some significant climate challenges in our future. And one of the things that space capabilities have to offer the world is really a deep understanding through these types of instruments of the challenges that we have from fires, from floods, from heat, from sea level rise. And one of the most recent announcements was of the Earth Information Center that Administrator Nelson highlighted at the most recent National Space Council. And of course, this is being added to NASA's efforts in the Earth science field overall, including most specifically the Earth Systems Observatory. But the reason that something like an Earth Information Center is needed is because it's not enough just to have the sensors. The people who need that information are at state government levels, they're in city governments, and they don't necessarily have the capacity to make use of this, frankly, rather complex data in such an easy way. And so there's a recognition now that there's a lot of work to be done in translating these incredibly valuable sensors into data that can be used for decision making. And that really is going to be a critical security issue for the country and, frankly, for the world as we deal with the climate changes to come in the decades ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned complex data, because whenever Raytheon Technologies talks about, anyone from Raytheon Technologies talks about artificial intelligence, machine learning, most people will think about the defense applications. And I think there's 2 instruments on orbit, VIRS, and there's a 3rd coming up.
Right.
So imagine all this data and what you can learn from it. And so the more data we get, the more that we learn from it, the better we get at the warnings. Certainly not much of a debate on whether we're contributing to national security.
Right.
I think, Alex, you both, I think, bring up an important point, though, about capacity building, because not only are state and local governments challenged in knowing how to use this, but many countries around the world are challenged in knowing how to do this. And at the same time, I've found that developing countries are often our best allies in space. They're dependent upon space for infrastructure, communications, navigation, remote sensing, and that kind of thing. And so to the extent they sometimes know their dependencies on space more deeply than we sometimes ourselves know it. And because of that, they're often willing to work with us very, very closely. So it's a way of building friends and allies, non-traditional relationships, with other countries. Roy, I mean, you were talking a bit about the problem, though, of, earlier about people don't understand, what that dependency is. I mean, what have you found in trying to talk to your industry colleagues, or maybe talking to the general public, about the degree of awareness about space? We're all space people here. We all think it's wonderful, and we all know it and love it, and we can recite facts and so forth. But for people who are not part of that community, what can we do?
Yeah, space community. So I can't say I'm a space person because I've only been in it for 10 years. And I learned that when I joined the space community that you have to be in it almost your entire life to be called a space person, because you have that deep knowledge. And no kidding, there is a deep knowledge. It's a specialized domain. Scott, what I mentioned is that I just don't believe that the average American understands the reliance that they have on their everyday life when it comes to the reliance on space assets. We just talked about weather. When you get your weather forecast, that is where you're getting a weather forecast, is from information that's from space. Many of you probably used your phone to get directions to get here. That's based on space-based information. Going to your ATM. I just don't believe that most Americans understand the importance. And so the support, the endorsement for things like we're doing at NASA is really important, because even though by definition, NASA is not serving military missions, we learn an awful lot from the experiments that NASA and NOAA continue to run to defend this nation. So I think they're critically important. You asked earlier about the role of industry. I do believe that we have upon us a responsibility to be that endorser of what we are doing in space, both on the military side and on the federal civil side. Certainly equally important, and contribute to where we are as a nation and where we will be as a nation.
So as I look at how, though, the role of private industry has changed, and industry has become much more capable and very, very innovative in a number of different fields, how is it, Alex, do you think, how NASA will change? What are the intellectual capabilities or skills or things that NASA needs in this environment? I mean, NASA's had criticisms on human capital and planning for the future, and it's hard to plan for the future if you don't know where you're going. Now that there's been more of a direction been done in this changing environment, and given the different roles government plays, maybe wearing an economist hat What do you see NASA needs to be able to do to be really an effective partner?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. And obviously, with a lot more commercial activity, going on, a lot more private dollars going into it. Obviously, you need a lot more economists, right? I mean, that's obviously first on the list. But in all seriousness, I remember joining NASA when you were at NASA in 2008, when we were working on the vision for space exploration. And NASA at that time was actually, I would argue, very different than it is today. It was run very much in a top-down kind of manner, right? And I think one of the big evolutions of the agency over the last 15 years has been recognizing that this desire to explore the cosmos, to go back to the moon, to go on to other planets, is not something that is held so much institutionally as it is held by people. And what that means is that some people, some individuals, particularly those with significant amounts of resources, particularly those who run companies that are entrepreneurial and who are able to access the US contracting environment to serve the nation, they are able to actually shape and dictate the flow of our activities in space, often as much and sometimes even more than the government. And I think it's taken a while for NASA to see that that is a great opportunity rather than a challenge. And I'm very proud that we have actually embraced that. Today, the Artemis program isn't just one endeavor, it's many. It's a commitment to delivering commercially payloads to the lunar surface. It is obviously the SLS and Orion. It's also an international partnership around the Gateway. And it is a commitment to having commercial services for at least some part of the human landing enterprise. That is a type of approach and a type of architecture that in 2008, I would have bet a lot of money that neither you or I would have predicted is where we would be today. So what does that mean we need in the future? Well, again, I repeat, more economists, but in all seriousness, we need to think more deeply about the relationships of supply and demand in each of these domains. When we started working there in 2008, we almost never talked about supply and demand. And now, thankfully, actually, in almost every domain, whether it's commercial space stations in low Earth orbit, whether it's robotic activities on the lunar surface, or human long-term habitation on the lunar surface, we're starting to talk about supply and demand and trying to understand the way in which you develop markets, the role that the government can play, the leadership that individual companies play, and then frankly being able to do the due diligence on some of what the companies propose may be the case in terms of markets is a really critical set of skills. And we have some of those inside the federal government, but I think we need to be investing more heavily in that. And you can bring some of that from the private sector. When we did COTS, we hired a venture capitalist who came into the agency for a 2-year tour to help with the due diligence around the COTS program. And I think we can benefit from more projects like that.
So Roy, same question. What would make you happier to see on the government side for a good customer? Obviously a well-funded customer, but what are the kind of skill sets that you want to see in order to have a good relationship, with your government customer? What do you want them to understand to make your communication and working with them easier?
I think that the most important thing, and certainly budgets are important, no doubt about it, and I'm guessing that it's the same way from our customers. They'd like to see us invest in their problems that they're trying to solve. The single biggest thing that I would tell you that we would like to see, I think, is this. Again, it's a mirror image. Transparency, as much transparency as we can get. Understanding the problems that customers are trying to solve. Understanding where they want to go. Understanding where they're investing their dollars. And then we in industry can make a decision on where we place our bets. There's never going to be a world where just because you know a problem, you're automatically going to be involved in the solution set. But I do think when I talk about innovation, the way that we use our own dollars, it has to be just as responsible on how we spend our customers' dollars. And so the transparency of understanding the roadmap, the desires, the thinking, the philosophy that each of our customer has serves both customers and industry well.
So let me ask about then an area of potential tension. In the case of, again, the Space Policy Directive, we talk about commercial and international partnerships. And from a U.S. government maybe standpoint, that seems pretty straightforward. Yes, there's ways to use commercial partnerships better. It's evolved over time, as Alex has talked about. We're used to having international partners as well. But in this new world of commercial, like particularly commercial LEO development, countries want to participate in Artemis, but if they're foreign companies, that's kind of a problem. They can set up a U.S. subsidiary, wholly owned, and we have a number of great examples of that, which are wonderful. But how do we think about expanding the opportunities for participation when we have both commercial objectives and sometimes, international objectives? If we build a commercial LEO platform, for example, obviously we want to sell research time to other countries, but those other countries are going to go, well, maybe I should fund my own company to go do that. Where are the trade-offs? Where are ways we can work together, or what are the potential solutions for resolving maybe some of the tensions between being commercial and being international? And again, as an international company, what some of the thoughts Raytheon has had, and what might we do? And then, Alex, I'd particularly like to hear your thoughts about commercial LEO.
Well, maybe just as a starting point, the single biggest thing that the United States will always have is scale and budget, as you said before. And Scott, you said something as we were preparing to come out here that I found really interesting, where there's different price points for getting involved in any project. And so when it comes to whether it's commercial or private, international, it is finding the fit. Because I actually believe that even though there are international companies, I know that there are going to be opportunities. The one thing that, at least from my point of view, is we shouldn't always assume that we have the best ideas. There are going to be really, really good ideas that come from our international partners, things that we haven't thought of, that we need to embrace. And certainly you alluded to in terms of some of the programs that we have where our allies want to be involved. Can they afford to be involved? Is there a way to do a partnership with an American company, an international company? We actually just purchased a company for Raytheon UK, a subsidiary of Raytheon Technologies. It's Norse, small company, space domain awareness, incredibly innovative way of getting the awareness piece of space domain awareness that I am extremely confident is something that when we bring the technology into the United States, there is definitely going to be interest, and we know of nothing that's like that in this country. So there's going to be others. And fact of the matter, pre-pandemic, I was at JAXA in Japan, and some of the things they were doing, I believe in partnership with NASA, were quite incredible. You talked about robotics, Alex, and it's some of the things that they've done. And so I do believe it's going to be around affordability, the international partners. And I know that General Armagno in the prior panel talked about, and General Raymond in many public statements has talked about the fact that the United States isn't going to go at it alone. We don't go at it alone in any other domain. We're certainly not going to do that in space. We need partnerships. We need to build allies. And I don't believe that that's only through the military side of things. It is certainly through the commercial side, the federal civil side.
Yeah, it's a complex question you asked specifically about low Earth orbit and commercial activities that are relative to international, because when the GATT agreements and the WTO were set up, I don't think time on space stations was covered, right?
It's a service. It's a service.
Right, and so it's something that actually, if other countries want to only spend money on their space industries, that they are well within their rights to do so. And that's actually where I think being able to understand the complexities of the supply and demand situation where it really comes in. I think we're still learning. I mean, the number of commercial space stations to date is still 0. And so we're trying to get to 1 on that, and we're hoping to get to more than 1. But to do that, we're going to have to see other countries probably being a non-trivial part of the demand signal on that. And we're going to have to see how that evolves relative to the demand signals that they send. There may be some countries who are very willing to send cash over the border. Others may not. And I think it's important to be both patient and also to recognize that this is going to be a nuanced position. I don't think it's going to be a very straightforward, one-size-fits-all kind of ruling. I think it's going to be complex in similar but different ways to the way the International Space Station was complex.
So I think the point about different price points, and people are going to be looking for different things. So if a country puts effort into a LEO platform, what do they get out of it? And what role NASA might play as an intermediary? You could imagine someone contributing capability and then using that as part of a trade arrangement or barter arrangement, because with some exceptions, we don't do exchanges of funds for international cooperation, but commercial companies can certainly do exchanges of funds with each other, and they can decide how to do that when partnering with NASA and working with their own national space agencies. Noting some of the time, there are a couple other questions I wanted to get to. You mentioned earlier, Roy, talking about space situational awareness and space traffic management. So we've had announcement of a contract for LEO Labs with Office of Space Commerce and buying some data. Obviously, hopefully more to come. But what do you see as the roles that the government and industry should take in having better space traffic management, better space situational awareness out there? I mean, because there's sort of a tension. On one hand, you want to make data publicly available to everybody because you don't want anybody to hit each other. At the same time, the value-added analytics that go on, in fact, is the bread and butter for many of these companies, beyond what's made publicly available. So where do you see that balance happening? Or where do you see maybe experiments happening to find that balance?
Well, the experiments are likely going to be around the technologies necessary. Where Raytheon Technologies also plays a role for the FAA on air traffic control. And so what you're referring to is air traffic control on steroids. I think the Space Force talked about tracking something like 35,000 pieces of debris last year in low Earth orbit. So, picture tracking debris and then tracking all of the satellites. And then if you're familiar with some of the work that's going on with the US government, proliferated low Earth orbit is real. There are contracts, there are launches, there's going to be satellites, and we're not the only ones there. So I do believe that it is going to take, to solve, this is not an easy problem to solve. It's a very difficult problem to solve. There are certain security constraints that have to take place in terms of having all of the data available to everybody, but in terms of the technologies that come to play, it's going to come from industry and it's going to come from government. It's going to come from experiments. And again, I would not be surprised if there's a large content and contribution from international partners. This problem has been around for a while and it is increasing exponentially, you'd probably agree, Alex. And so I do think it's going to take different technologies.
Obviously, for space situational awareness and things like that, that's more the Office of Space Commerce from the civil side than NASA. But NASA's starting to take a lot more interest in just some of the fundamental technologies for things like space debris mitigation and even eventually potentially active debris removal. We're still in the R&D phase, but because it's very clear that this is a problem that's not going away, and that fundamentally, our job is also to keep our crew safe in low Earth orbit. And there are potential risks to significant increases in space debris, and so I think it is time to start to ramping up our space debris research activities.
And in that, though, I don't hear somebody saying that this is going to be a purely commercial solution or a purely government solution, that this is going to be a hybrid of some sort.
I would agree.
No doubt in my mind.
Okay. And that poses some interesting governance questions, but that's maybe more of an academic discussion for maybe another panel. I see we're wrapping up, and just like to say thank you. And any last minute I forgot sort of points you want to make sure you make?
Go Artemis. That's about it.
Go Artemis. All right. Well, I say go Artemis too because we have a role in that.
Exactly.
So it's good for the nation. It's good for everyone.
That's right.
Roy, anything else?
I'm good. Thank you.
Well, super. Thank you all very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and enjoyed the conversation here with our colleagues. And I look forward to the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Feel better.